She had nothing. No money, no family, no last name that meant anything. Just a girl left at a stone-walled orphanage in the French countryside, learning to sew because there was nothing else to do. And yet, by the time she died in 1971, Gabrielle Chanel had built a fashion empire that was generating what would today be equivalent to billions of dollars annually. She had personally dressed the most powerful women in the world. She had rewritten the rules of femininity so completely that we are still living inside the blueprint she created over a century ago. Think about that for a moment. The little black dress you've seen in 1,000 films, the quilted handbag with the gold chain strap, the interlocking CC logo on perfume bottles that sell one every 30 seconds somewhere on Earth. Chanel No. 5 alone, a fragrance she launched in 1921, generates over $100 million in revenue every single year. One perfume, still. But here's what most people miss when they talk about Coco Chanel. The story isn't really about fashion at all. It's about a woman who weaponized invention, who understood decades before anyone else that how a woman felt in her clothing was more powerful than how she looked. It's about a survivor who rewrote her own biography so thoroughly that even today historians are still untangling the myths she planted about herself. And it's about contradiction, because the woman who liberated women from corsets also collaborated with Nazi officers during the German occupation of Paris. The woman who built an empire out of nothing also spent the last decade of her career in bitter exile, convinced the world had abandoned her. She was relentless, ruthless, brilliant and complicated, in ways that make her almost impossible to reduce to a simple narrative. This is the story of Coco Chanel, the orphan who sewed in a convent, the cabaret singer who learned to read a room, the designer who dismantled an entire century's idea of what women should look like, and built a billion-dollar empire from the rubble. Let's go back to the beginning. By 1957, when Coco Chanel received the Neiman Marcus Award for Distinguished Service in the field of fashion in Dallas, Texas, she was already a legend. White-haired, immaculately dressed, composed in that particular way that people mistake for coldness, she accepted the award the way she accepted most things, like she had expected it all along. The room was full of people who had grown up wearing her ideas without knowing it. The relaxed silhouettes, the jersey fabric used for women's clothing, the costume jewelry was worn proudly alongside real pearls. The idea, radical in 1957, that a woman's clothes should let her move, what most people in that room didn't know was the truth about where she came from. Because Coco Chanel had spent most of her adult life constructing a biography. She told interviewers she was born in 1893. She claimed her mother died when she was young, and her father took her to live with aunts in the countryside. The real version was harder. Her mother died in 1895, when Gabrielle was 12. Her father, Albert Chanel, a traveling street vendor who sold workwear and undergarments from a cart, dropped her and her sisters at the Orphan orphanage in Corrèze, and then essentially disappeared from her life. The orphanage was run by nuns of the Congregation of the Sacred Heart of Mary. It sat in a valley in central France, a place that smelled of stone and candle wax, and the particular clean linen scent of an institution where everything is regulated down to the quarter hour. Gabrielle lived there from age 12 to 18. She learned to sew. She mended vestments, hemmed habits, and stitched the kind of basic, precise needlework that would later show up in the clean lines of her designs. There's a detail that historians find interesting. The floors of the Orphan Abbey are decorated with interlocking geometric patterns, double C shapes, circular motifs, the exact kind of abstracted interlocking design that Chanel would later make into one of the most recognizable logos in the history of commerce. Whether it was conscious or not, whether she looked at those floors as a girl and filed something away, nobody can say for certain. But the echo is there. After Orphan, she spent time at a boarding school in Moulins, and then in her early 20s, she started performing at small cafes and music halls. She sang 2 songs, mostly Qui qu'a vu Coco dans le Trocadero and Coco Rico. The audiences gave her the nickname that would follow her the rest of her life, Coco. She wasn't a great singer. She was, however, a great reader of rooms. She understood very quickly how to hold attention, how to position herself, how to make people want to watch her. Those skills, the ability to read desire and shape it, would become the engine of everything she built. In Moulins and later Vichy, she met two men who would define the next decade of her life. Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir who kept racehorses and a sprawling estate called Royalou, and Arthur Boy Capel, a British polo player and businessman who would become the great love of her life. Both relationships were unconventional. Chanel was neither a wife nor a paid companion. She occupied an in-between space that suited her, close to money and influence without being defined by it. It was Balsan who first gave her a physical space to create. It was Capel who believed her ambitions were real and helped finance her first hat shop in Paris in 1910. And it was Chanel who, from that tiny shopfront on Rue Cambon, began quietly dismantling the fashion world's assumptions about what women needed. But to understand how she did it, and why it worked, we need to go back to what women were actually wearing in 1910, and what that clothing meant. Walk into any museum with a collection of Edwardian women's fashion, and the first thing you notice is the structure. The corsets that compressed the waist down to 18 or 20 inches, the whalebone and wire, the layered petticoats, the enormous hats pinned into elaborate hairstyles, the sleeves, the trains, the sheer physical weight of a well-dressed woman in 1910. This wasn't just aesthetic, it was architectural. A woman of means wore clothing that required help to put on and help to take off. The act of dressing was a statement of status. You needed servants, you needed time, you needed a body disciplined enough to hold the required posture for hours. Fashion in that era was dominated almost entirely by male designers working for a clientele of wealthy women and aristocrats. Paul Poiret was the most famous. Worth was the most prestigious. The whole machinery of haute couture was built around the idea that clothing was sculpture, that the woman was the armature inside. Chanel walked into this world with a completely different instinct. She had grown up in an institution where clothing was functional. She had watched cafe audiences and racetrack crowds. She understood, from the inside, not from theory, that the women around her were uncomfortable, not just physically, symbolically. The clothing signaled constraint in ways that were starting to feel wrong in a world beginning to question other kinds of constraint. Her first move was hats. In 1910, she opened Chanel Modes at 21 Rue Cambon in Paris. The hats she made were radical by the standards of the time. They were simple. No enormous brims, no towers of feathers and ribbons, just clean, elegant shapes that let the face be the focal point. They looked modern. They looked effortless. And effortless, in 1910, was a revolutionary aesthetic choice. Word spread quickly among the kind of women who attended the theaters and horse races where Chanel had performed and socialized. Actresses, the wives of wealthy men, women who understood intuitively that the hats were saying something new. Within 2 years, she had enough clients to open a second location in Deauville, the seaside resort town where wealthy Parisians spent the summer. Deauville was where hats became something larger. She opened a boutique there in 1913, and she started selling something genuinely unprecedented: women's sportswear made from jersey. Jersey was a knit fabric. It was comfortable, stretchy, machine washable. It was what men's underwear was made from. Using it for women's outerwear was, to put it mildly, not done. Chanel didn't care. She made jersey skirts and tops that women could actually move in. She designed garments for cycling, for walking on the beach, for the physical reality of a day that involved actual activity. And the women who wore them reported something that sounds almost embarrassingly simple. They felt good. They could breathe. You see, the genius wasn't the fabric itself. It was understanding that women were ready for permission to be comfortable, and that if you gave them that permission wrapped in elegance, they would take it. Sales at the Deauville boutique exceeded what anyone had predicted. By 1915, she had opened a third location in Biarritz. By the time World War I ended, Chanel had 300 employees and was generating revenues that made her financially independent of any man for the first time in her life. The first real chapter of the empire was written not on Rue Cambon, but on the beaches of the French Riviera, with a bolt of jersey fabric and a pair of scissors. But the real revolution was still coming. 1919 was the year everything changed for Coco Chanel, not because of what she built, because of what she lost. Arthur Boy Capel, the British polo player who had financed her first shop, who had believed in her ambitions when most people around her saw a cabaret singer with ideas above her station, was killed in a car accident on December 22, 1919. His Rolls-Royce blew a tire on the road between Cannes and Nice. He died at the scene. He was 38 years old. Chanel was not his wife. She had no official standing. She was, by the social conventions of the time, nothing. A lover, a companion, a woman without a formal claim to grief. And yet, by every account we have, she was devastated in a way she never fully recovered from. She dressed in black for a year. She redesigned mourning. She turned her grief into work. What came out of that period was the foundational Chanel aesthetic: simplicity, restraint, the radical idea that less was more at a time when fashion was still obsessed with excess. Here's the thing about simplicity in 1920s fashion. It wasn't a universal value. It was a statement. The dominant trend in post-war Paris was still abundance, elaborate beadwork, feathers, the opulent visual language of Art Deco. Chanel looked at that language and chose silence instead. She began designing clothes in dark neutral tones: navy, beige, cream, black, shapes that followed the body instead of reshaping it, skirts that rose to the calf, which was, for the 1920s, borderline scandalous, collars that lay flat, pockets, actual functional pockets, sewn into women's garments at a time when pockets were a feature reserved almost exclusively for men's clothing. Consider that detail for a moment. Pockets. The act of putting your hand somewhere, of carrying something, of not having to hold an elaborate reticule in front of you at all times. Chanel was encoding a different idea of womanhood into the physical design of clothing. In 1921, she did something that had nothing to do with fabric. She commissioned a perfume. The story of Chanel No. 5 begins with Ernest Bose, a perfumer who had worked for the Russian imperial court before the revolution. Chanel asked him for something unprecedented, a perfume that smelled like a woman, not like a flower. She wanted something abstract, something modern, something that didn't announce itself with a single ingredient. Bose created several samples, numbered 1 through 5 and 20 through 24. Chanel chose No. 5. According to Bose, she chose it partly because it was the most complex, the first fragrance to use a significant quantity of aldehydes, synthetic aromatic compounds, that gave it a clean, abstract quality unlike anything on the market. She launched it by doing something elegant and low cost. She sprayed it in the fitting rooms of her boutique. Women who tried on her clothes left smelling like Chanel No. 5. They asked what the scent was. She told them. Word spread the way word always spread in the closed world of Parisian fashion, through dinner parties and drawing rooms and the quiet authority of the right people telling other right people. By 1924, she had signed a licensing deal with the Wertheimer family, Pierre and Paul Wertheimer, who owned a major perfume distribution company, that would give them 70% of the profits in exchange for full manufacturing and distribution. Chanel kept 10%. Her business partner Théophile Beda got 20% for making the introduction. The deal would haunt her for decades. She would spend years trying to renegotiate it, arguing she had been exploited. And by the raw numbers, she had 70% of the profits from the best-selling perfume of the 20th century. Is staggering. But the deal had also made her rich beyond what she could have achieved alone, and it had put No. 5 in front of a global audience she could never have reached without the Wertheimer distribution network. What nobody focused on in 1924 was the quiet fact that Chanel had just done something no fashion designer had done before at that scale. She had extended her brand into a consumable product. She had turned herself into a smell, into something that could be bottled and shipped and sold to women who would never be able to afford a couture dress. The empire had its first global product, and Coco Chanel was only getting started. In 1926, American Vogue published an illustration of a simple Chanel design. It was a short-sleeved black crepe dress, straight cut, ending just below the knee. No ornamentation, no elaborate trim, just a precisely constructed black dress that a woman could wear almost anywhere. Vogue called it Chanel's Ford. The comparison to Henry Ford's Model T was intentional. Like the Model T, it was designed to be democratic. It could be made in different fabrics, copied at different price points, adapted and remade 1,000 times. And like the Model T, it would end up everywhere. The little black dress was not exactly Chanel's invention in isolation. Black had been worn for mourning for centuries, and simple cuts had been explored by other designers. But what Chanel did was strip away the associations. Black, in the fashion world of 1926, still carried the weight of mourning, of absence, of elderly widowhood. She replaced those associations with something different. Black as the ultimate sophistication. Black as freedom from having to match anything. Black as power. Look, the cultural shift here is difficult to overstate. A woman in 1925 owned perhaps 2 or 3 formal dresses. They were expensive, elaborate, tied to specific occasions. The little black dress, as Chanel was designing it, proposed something radical, a garment versatile enough to be a uniform. You dressed it up with pearls and a jacket. You dressed it down with flat shoes and bare arms. You wore it to dinner, to the theater, to a business meeting. You owned one and it worked everywhere. That wasn't just aesthetic design, it was economic design. It changed how women related to their wardrobes. By the late 1920s, Chanel was the most influential designer in the world. Her client list included Vera Lombardi, who connected her to the British aristocracy and the royal family. She was dressing the Duchess of Westminster. She was being photographed alongside Pablo Picasso, Igor Stravinsky, and Salvador Dali. She had friendships, complicated, reciprocal, charged with mutual influence, with some of the most significant artists of the 20th century. She designed costumes for Jean Cocteau's theatrical productions. She helped finance Stravinsky and his family when they arrived in Paris as refugees. After the Russian Revolution, she had a long affair with the Duke of Westminster, one of the wealthiest men in Britain, who gave her access to a world of British aristocracy that she absorbed and translated into a particular aesthetic: tweeds, menswear fabrics, the paradox of absolute wealth, worn with calculated understatement. Here's what's interesting about all these relationships. Chanel was almost never the social inferior in any of them, despite her origins. She had figured out something about power, that in the right context, being from nowhere is its own kind of credential. She didn't fit into any existing category of woman. She wasn't a wife or a mistress, or an aristocrat or a working-class girl. She was Chanel, and that was a category she had invented herself. Her workforce during this period numbered in the thousands. She had multiple ateliers in Paris, operating continuously to produce couture collections twice a year, and the growing range of accessories, perfumes, and jewelry that had become part of the brand. She had industrialized artisanal craftsmanship in a way that nobody had done before at that scale. The money was significant. The influence was extraordinary. And then, in 1929, the world fell apart. The stock market crash wiped out enormous portions of the clientele that luxury fashion depended on. Competitors who had mocked Chanel's simplicity, most notably Elsa Schiaparelli, who was doing something completely different with surrealism and color and shocking visual spectacle, started to eat into her market. The Depression changed what wealthy women wanted from fashion, and the answer for many of them was not Chanel's studied minimalism, but something more theatrical, more escapist, more loudly expensive looking. Chanel fought back by doing what she always did, by refusing to follow the logic of the moment, by trusting that what she was building would outlast the current disruption. She was right, but the next decade would test that conviction in ways she hadn't anticipated. On September 3, 1939, France declared war on Germany following the invasion of Poland. Within 8 months, Paris had fallen. By June 1940, German officers were walking the streets of the city that had made Coco Chanel. She closed her fashion house almost immediately. There are various explanations she gave over the years. That it wasn't the right time for fashion, that she refused to work under occupation, that she was protecting her workers. The reality is more complicated and significantly darker. What is documented fact? Coco Chanel checked into the Hotel Ritz in Paris, which had become the preferred accommodation of senior German officers, and she began a relationship with Hans Günther von Dinklage, a German intelligence officer 13 years her junior. Von Dinklage, known by the nickname Spatz, meaning sparrow, was not a neutral figure. He was an operative whose precise role remains disputed by historians, but whose connections to the German intelligence apparatus are not. For 4 years, while France was occupied, Chanel lived at the Ritz in relative comfort. She had no food shortages, no displacement, none of the deprivations that most Parisians endured. Her arrangement with von Dinklage provided protection, and she was, by the evidence that has since emerged, not passively protected, but actively engaged with German intelligence in at least one documented mission. The operation was called Westminster. In 1943 or 1944, accounts vary, Chanel was sent to Madrid on what appears to have been a mission to use her connection with the Duke of Westminster to open a back-channel communication with Winston Churchill. The mission failed. Churchill either never received the message or chose not to respond. Chanel returned to Paris. Her code name in the documents of the German Abwehr intelligence service was Westminster. That is not disputed. What historians argue about is what this means. Was she a true ideological collaborator, an opportunist protecting herself and her assets, a woman using the only currency available to her, personal relationships, to survive? Hal Vaughan, who wrote the most detailed investigation of this period in his book, Sleeping with the Enemy, concluded that Chanel was a genuine anti-Semite who saw collaboration as philosophically coherent, not merely convenient. The picture is complicated further by what she attempted to do with the Wertheimer family during the occupation. Pierre and Paul Wertheimer had fled France to the United States, where they continued operating the Chanel perfume business. Chanel, under the Vichy government's Aryanization laws, which allowed Jewish-owned businesses to be seized and transferred to non-Jewish owners, filed a claim arguing that she was the rightful owner of the perfume company because the Wertheimers were Jewish and had gotten the original deal under unfair terms. The Wertheimers, anticipating this move, had already transferred formal ownership to a French industrialist named Félix Amiot, a Gentile, which meant the Aryanization claim had nothing to seize. The move protected the business and protected them. Chanel's attempt to use Nazi law to seize the company failed completely. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, Chanel was briefly detained and questioned by the Free French forces investigating collaboration. She was released within hours. There is persistent belief, supported by some historians and disputed by others, that her release was facilitated by Churchill himself, or at least by figures connected to British intelligence, who wanted the whole episode quietly buried. Whatever the precise mechanism, Chanel left Paris for Switzerland shortly after her release and lived in exile for nearly a decade. She was 70 years old. Her fashion house was closed. Many of her contemporaries assumed she was finished. They were wrong. On February 5, 1954, Coco Chanel presented a new couture collection at 31 Rue Cambon in Paris. She was 70 years old. She had been away from fashion for 15 years, and she was, in the judgment of almost every major French fashion critic present that day, a disaster. The French press was brutal. Le Figaro called the collection a melancholy retrospective. Other critics used words like outdated, nostalgic, regressive. The general consensus was that Chanel had misjudged the moment badly. The dominant aesthetic in 1954 was Christian Dior's new look, nipped waists, full skirts, a hyper-femininity that deliberately invoked pre-war luxury and elegance. After years of wartime austerity, French women and the fashion press wanted abundance, drama, construction. Chanel gave them jersey suits with patch pockets. But here's what the French critics missed. The Americans didn't agree with them. American fashion editors and buyers who attended the same show responded to the collection almost entirely differently. Life magazine ran a photographic spread. Women's Wear Daily called it a success. American buyers placed orders. And within 12 months, something interesting began happening. French opinion started to shift. Because American customers were buying the suits, department stores across the United States were stocking them, and the women buying them were not the idle rich of the couture client list, but working women, professional women, women who needed to move through the world efficiently and wanted to look authoritative while doing it. The Chanel suit, boucle tweed, trim cardigan jacket, knee-length skirt, quilted lining, gold buttons, precise fit, became the uniform of a particular kind of modern woman. It was the suit that Jacqueline Kennedy wore on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, the pink Chanel suit she refused to change out of after her husband was shot, blood still on the fabric, because she wanted the world to see what they had done. That image, one of the most photographed in the 20th century, was wearing Chanel. The suit's second life was more successful than its first. Alongside the suit, Chanel introduced or reintroduced several elements that would become defining design signatures. The quilted handbag with the gold chain strap, the 2.55, launched in February 1955, named for its introduction date. The two-tone shoe, beige with a dark toe cap that optically lengthened the leg. The layered costume jewelry that deliberately imitated real pearls and gemstones, without pretending to be them. A philosophical statement about ornament that was almost political in a fashion world where real jewelry signified real wealth. She was also working with new business partners. The Wertheimers, whom she had tried to have dispossessed during the occupation, had somehow moved past the episode with a pragmatism that remains remarkable. In 1954, they financed her return. In 1965, after her death, they would buy the entire Chanel company outright from her estate. The relationship between Chanel and the Wertheimers is one of the stranger ironies in the history of 20th century business. She had tried to seize their company using Nazi law. They had outmaneuvered her. And then, when she needed financing to stage a comeback, they provided it. And then their family became the owners of everything she had built. The late 1950s and 1960s were productive and genuinely triumphant. The Neiman Marcus Award in 1957, a Coty Award in America. The spreading influence of her aesthetic through the ready-to-wear industry, which was mass-producing Chanel-adjacent designs for a middle-class market she had never directly served, but had absolutely influenced. But even in triumph, she remained difficult, obsessive. She redesigned collections obsessively, sometimes making alterations at midnight the night before a show. She could be devastating to the workers in her atelier, precise in her demands in ways that tipped into cruelty. She was funny and cutting and exhausting, and by most accounts deeply lonely. What she had built was extraordinary. What it had cost her personally, relationally, morally, was also extraordinary. On January 10, 1971, Coco Chanel had a fitting. She was 87 years old, still working, still running her atelier, still making changes to the upcoming spring collection that was scheduled to show in late January. She spent the afternoon reviewing the work, made corrections, spoke with her assistants. Then she went back to her suite at the Hotel Ritz, where she had lived since the 1930s, the same hotel where she had spent the war years with von Dinklage, the same building she had refused to leave through liberation and exile and return. On January 10, 1971, at the Ritz Paris, Coco Chanel died of natural causes in her bed. She was alone. Her funeral was held 4 days later at the Église de la Madeleine in Paris. Her models wore her designs to carry her flowers. The tributes were enormous, from heads of state, from artists, from the fashion world and far beyond it. Salvador Dali sent flowers. Marlene Dietrich attended. The French government honored her. But she had never married. She had no children. The great love of her life, Arthur Capel, had been dead for more than 50 years. She left behind no immediate family, and she left the bulk of her estate to her LAA workers, a gesture that surprised people who knew only the public version of her and not the private one. The spring collection she had been preparing for was presented posthumously 3 weeks after her death. The fashion world wept, and then did what fashion worlds do. It moved on. What happened next is one of the most interesting stories in the business of luxury. The Wertheimer family bought the Chanel company outright. They had been financing the operation since her return in 1954, and they now owned it completely. For the next decade and a half, Chanel operated on the momentum of its heritage. The No. 5 perfume, the suits, the quilted bags, the logo, without a major creative identity at the center. Then, in 1983, they hired Karl Lagerfeld as creative director. Lagerfeld's appointment is one of the most consequential decisions in 20th century fashion business. He understood, intuitively, that Chanel's power was not in preserving what Chanel had created, but in translating the underlying logic of it for each new decade. The logic being, simplicity is the most radical choice. Ease is the highest luxury. The woman wearing the clothes is more important than the clothes. Under Lagerfeld, the company expanded from couture into ready-to-wear, into accessories, into a global retail infrastructure. He worked at Chanel for 36 years, until his death in 2019. During that period, the company grew from a heritage brand coasting on its archive into one of the most commercially successful luxury houses in the world. Today, Chanel is privately held by the Wertheimer family. It does not publish detailed financials, but industry estimates put its annual revenue at over $17 billion as of the early 2020s. It operates more than 500 boutiques globally. The No. 5 perfume still sells a bottle every 30 seconds somewhere on Earth. The brand that started with a hat shop on Rue Cambon, financed by a British polo player, operated by an orphaned girl who had learned to sew in a convent, is worth, by most estimates, somewhere between $40 and $60 billion, making it one of the most valuable private companies on Earth. She started with nothing. She built something that has outlasted her by half a century and shows no signs of stopping. One of the things that makes Coco Chanel's legacy so interesting and so contested is how invisible most of it is. We live inside her design decisions without knowing it, and most of what we think we know about her is partly constructed. Start with what she actually invented versus what she gets credit for. The little black dress was not exclusively her invention. The bob haircut she made fashionable was adopted from a male hairdresser named Antoinette Coman. Jersey fabric had been used in other contexts before she applied it to women's wear. Chanel No. 5 was created by a perfumer, not by her. But invention in fashion and in branding is never only about the idea. It's about context, timing, authority, and distribution. Chanel had all four. She understood that being the person who popularized something and made it culturally legible was often more powerful than being the person who first thought of it. She was a synthesizer and an amplifier at least as much as she was an originator, and that combination turned out to be exactly what the moment required. Think about what she was actually doing between 1910 and 1940. She was moving across class lines in ways that were genuinely unusual for a woman of her background. She was building relationships with artists and aristocrats and industrialists simultaneously. She was observing each of those worlds and translating what she learned into a design language that could speak to all of them at once. The tweeds she started using after her relationship with the Duke of Westminster came from Scottish fishing villages. The clean lines she preferred came from her convent upbringing. The theatrical simplicity she developed came from watching performers. She had been one, and understanding how an audience's eye works. She was a synthesizer of class aesthetics in an era when those classes were supposed to be hermetically sealed from each other. And she was doing it as a woman, which is the detail that tends to get lost in the celebration of her genius. Every male designer of her era operated with institutional support that Chanel had to build from scratch. Worth had family money. Poiret had aristocratic patronage built into the structure of the fashion industry from the beginning. Even her rivals had frameworks she had to dismantle or work around. She had Balson's hospitality and Capel's early investment, and then she had herself. Her influence on menswear is rarely discussed, but genuinely significant. She borrowed from men's wardrobe so thoroughly that the exchange became mutual. The sailor collar, the blazer worn as a woman's jacket, the trousers she began wearing publicly in the 1920s, which were genuinely transgressive, legally and socially. She didn't just borrow masculinity. She revealed that the distinction between masculine and feminine design was mostly arbitrary convention. The designers who came after her, Yves Saint Laurent most explicitly, acknowledged the debt. Saint Laurent called her the only true genius of 20th century fashion. That's a competitive field and a large statement, but it recognizes something real. Chanel didn't just create beautiful things. She changed the operating assumptions of the entire industry. And then there's the dark side of the legacy, which cannot be quietly footnoted. Her anti-Semitism was not a secret during her lifetime, and the wartime collaboration is not a matter of disputed interpretation at its core. The documented facts are what they are. The question is how to hold that alongside the rest of her life. There's no formula for that. Genius and cruelty and self-invention and collaboration can all live in the same person. History is full of examples. What's specific to Chanel is how completely she controlled her own narrative, how successfully she buried and rewrote the parts she didn't want people to see. Her public persona was almost entirely constructed. Even the name Coco was a performance that outlasted its origins. She built an empire. She also made choices that harmed people and that she never publicly acknowledged or apologized for. Both things are true. Walk past any Chanel boutique today, on Bond Street in London, on Fifth Avenue in New York, on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, and what you're seeing is a business that has been run for 60 years by the Wertheimer family, the same family that Chanel tried to dispossess during World War II. Alain Wertheimer, grandson of Pierre, has been the chairman and co-owner of Chanel since 1974. He is, by most estimates, worth somewhere between $30 and $50 billion, making him one of the wealthiest people in the world. His fortune is built almost entirely on the brand of a woman who tried to seize his grandfather's stake in that same brand using the legal instruments of Nazi occupation. The irony is almost too large to process. But Chanel, the company, has managed this history with extraordinary care. The wartime collaboration is acknowledged in academic contexts. It is not prominently featured in the brand's own historical narrative. The company focuses, understandably, on the design legacy, the perfume, the craftsmanship, the female empowerment narrative. That narrative is not false, it is partial. The empowerment story is real. Chanel did free women from corsets. She did create clothes that allowed movement and agency. She did build a business at a time when women building businesses were anomalies. The feminist reading of her work is grounded in genuine innovation that genuinely changed how women dressed, moved, and thought about what clothing was for. The collaboration story is also real. She did have a German intelligence officer as a companion during occupation. She did attempt to use Aryanization law to seize Jewish-owned property. She did, by most historical accounts, hold anti-Semitic views. The fashion world has handled this the way it handles most uncomfortable histories, by quietly acknowledging it in footnotes while continuing to sell the myth. There have been calls for more direct reckoning, particularly from Jewish advocacy groups and historians. The company has not, as of this writing, made any formal public acknowledgement of the wartime episode or its implications. What the company has done is build the Wertheimer family's decision to expand aggressively under Karl Lagerfeld in the 1980s transformed Chanel from a prestigious archive into a contemporary commercial empire. The decision to remain private, to never go public, never take on outside investors, never submit to the quarterly earnings pressures that reshape publicly traded luxury companies, has allowed the brand to make long-term decisions that most competitors cannot make. The 2.55 handbag now sells for over $10,000 in most markets. The price has increased many hundreds of % over the past 2 decades, a deliberate strategy to maintain exclusivity as the global luxury consumer base has expanded. The No. 5 perfume, at the other end of the price spectrum, remains accessible at most luxury department stores, the democratic gesture inside the exclusive brand. Now let's talk about what the Wertheimer family actually did with what they inherited, because this part of the story is rarely told with the detail it deserves. When Coco Chanel died in January 1971, the company that bore her name was, in commercial terms, a shadow of what it had once been. The couture operation was prestigious but small. The perfume business, particularly No. 5, was generating serious revenue, but the brand architecture around it was fragile. Chanel, the woman, had been the brand. Without her, what exactly was Chanel? That question sat unanswered for roughly a decade. Alain Wertheimer and his brother Gerard inherited control of the company from their father Jacques in 1974. Alain was 25 years old. He had no background in fashion. What he had was a lawyer's instinct for long-term strategic positioning and an almost obsessive conviction that Chanel's most dangerous enemy was overexposure. His first major decision was to pull back. In the mid-1970s, Chanel had licensed its name to a range of products that diluted the brand almost beyond recognition. Chanel-branded sunglasses, scarves, watches, and various accessories were being produced and distributed by third parties with relatively little quality control. The logo was everywhere, and everywhere in luxury is the beginning of nowhere. Wertheimer began systematically buying back those licenses. It was expensive, it took years. It required the company to forego significant short-term revenue in exchange for long-term brand integrity. But by the early 1980s, Chanel's name appeared only on products the Wertheimer company directly controlled. That discipline, which runs completely counter to the logic of most consumer goods companies, is one of the foundational reasons the brand is worth what it's worth today. You cannot build extreme luxury on ubiquity. Chanel understood this instinctively in the 1920s, when she designed clothes that only certain women could afford. Alain Wertheimer understood it in the 1970s, when he started buying back licenses that were turning the logo into wallpaper. The second major decision was Lagerfeld. Karl Lagerfeld's appointment as creative director in 1983 is almost universally described as a masterstroke, which can make it sound more inevitable than it actually was. At the time, it was a gamble. Lagerfeld was known, he had been the creative director at Chloé, and he was working at Fendi. He was respected, prolific, clearly talented. But he was also famously difficult, famously opinionated, and famously uninterested in being anyone's steward. There was a real concern in some quarters that Lagerfeld would remake Chanel in his own image rather than Chanel's. What happened instead was something more interesting. Lagerfeld studied Chanel, the woman, the archive, the underlying logic, with the attention of an academic and the instincts of a showman. He understood something that many designers miss: the difference between the letter and the spirit of a design language. The letter is the specific garments, the exact shapes, the particular fabrics. The spirit is the underlying attitude. In Chanel's case, the idea that elegance is ease, that restraint is power, that the woman wearing the clothes should always be more interesting than the clothes themselves. Lagerfeld honored the spirit and remade the letter for every decade he worked there. The buccal tweed jacket of 1983 looked different from the buccal tweed jacket of 2010, but both of them were saying the same thing in a language the current moment could receive. That's an almost impossible creative trick to pull off consistently across 36 years. He was also a commercial genius, in a way that doesn't always get acknowledged. He understood that Chanel needed to exist at multiple price points simultaneously, that the couture show at the Grand Palais, with its elaborate theatrical set and celebrity front row, was advertising for the fragrance that a 22-year-old could buy at a department store. The show wasn't just a show. It was content, before content was a category. He also understood scale. Under his leadership, Chanel expanded from roughly 200 boutiques globally to over 500. It entered markets, China, the Gulf states, Southeast Asia, that were generating new luxury consumers at a pace that older European luxury brands were struggling to meet. Lagerfeld moved faster because Wertheimer let him move faster. The private structure meant no one had to explain a bold market entry decision to a quarterly earnings call. By the time Lagerfeld died in February 2019, Chanel was generating somewhere north of $12 billion in annual revenue and was considered, alongside LVMH's flagship brands, one of the 5 most valuable luxury companies on earth. What he left behind was a company that had completely solved the hardest problem in luxury: how to grow without diluting, how to become more available without becoming less desirable, how to be everywhere important while staying out of everywhere ordinary. The economics of Chanel today are worth spending some time on because they're genuinely unusual in the global luxury landscape. Most luxury companies are publicly traded. LVMH, which owns Louis Vuitton, Dior, Givenchy, Bulgari, Tiffany and roughly 75 other brands, is publicly traded on the Paris Stock Exchange. Kering, which owns Gucci, Saint Laurent, Bottega Veneta and Balenciaga, is publicly traded. Richemont, which owns Cartier, Van Cleef & Arpels and IWC, is publicly traded. Chanel is not. That distinction matters enormously in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Public companies answer to shareholders. Shareholders want growth, preferably every quarter, ideally every year. Growth in luxury typically means either raising prices, opening more stores, or launching new product lines. All 3 of those levers pushed too hard for too long erode brand exclusivity. The history of luxury is littered with brands that went from prestigious to accessible to unfashionable in a single generation of aggressive growth. The Wertheimers answer to no one outside the family. They can decide, in a given year, to open fewer stores than revenue projections would support because they think the brand's long-term health requires restraint. They can invest in craft preservation, the Métier d'Art program, which supports and acquires the small artisanal workshops that supply Chanel's couture at a level that makes no short-term financial sense, but preserves a supply chain that is genuinely irreplaceable. They can price the 2.55 handbag at $10,000, then $12,000, then $14,000, because they've decided the aspiration created by that price point is more valuable than the additional volume they'd sell at $8,000. Every one of those decisions would be nearly impossible to make inside a public company without a shareholder revolt. The result is a brand that has retained a kind of mystique that most luxury companies have lost. You can see it in the resale market. A classic Chanel handbag does not depreciate the way most luxury goods depreciate. The 2.55 and the classic flap hold their value, and in many cases appreciate in value, in a way that is essentially unprecedented for a mass-produced consumer good. The secondary market for Chanel handbags is worth billions of dollars annually. People buy them as investments. That's not marketing. That's structural scarcity combined with consistent quality over decades. Here's what's interesting about the geographic spread of Chanel's modern business, because it says something about how luxury actually works in the 21st century. When Alan Wertheimer began the expansion push in the 1980s, Chanel's primary markets were Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. Japan, in particular, was enormously important. Japanese consumers in the 1980s and 1990s were among the most brand-conscious luxury buyers in the world, and Chanel's position there was extraordinary. Then China changed everything. The growth of a Chinese luxury consumer class over the past 20 years is arguably the most significant shift in the global luxury industry since the invention of the department store. By the early 2020s, Chinese consumers, including purchases made both in mainland China and abroad, accounted for somewhere between 30 and 40% of global luxury spending. That's not a niche, that's the engine. Chanel's approach to China has been characteristically disciplined. The brand opened stores in mainland China later than most competitors. It kept its store count lower than brands of comparable prestige. It resisted the pressure, and there was significant pressure, to create China-specific product lines or to engage heavily in the live-stream commerce model that was generating enormous luxury sales volumes on platforms like Tmall and WeChat. The reasoning was consistent with everything the Wertheimers had done since the 1970s. China-specific products would create a two-tier brand. Live-stream commerce, at that volume and speed, would make the brand look accessible in ways that conflicted with the price positioning. Better to be the brand that Chinese luxury consumers aspired to precisely because it was slightly harder to get. Whether this discipline holds as the market matures is an open question. Competitors who moved faster captured significant early share, but Chanel's position in the Chinese market remains strong, and crucially, it hasn't been purchased at the cost of brand dilution. Let's talk about perfume for a moment, because the perfume business is where the original Chanel genius most clearly survives in its commercial form. Chanel No. 5 was not the first synthetic perfume, but it was the first synthetic perfume marketed as a luxury object. Before No. 5, perfumes were marketed around their natural ingredients. This is a rose perfume, this is a jasmine perfume, this is a floral blend. The ingredient was the story. No. 5 was marketed as an abstract. It didn't smell like a specific flower. It smelled like luxury. It smelled like Chanel. That was a fundamental reframing. Ernest Bose created the formula, but Chanel created the concept, the idea that a perfume could be a brand statement rather than a botanical description. The commercial longevity of No. 5 is genuinely staggering. It has been the best-selling perfume in the world for most of the past 100 years. It has survived fashion cycles, wars, the rise of entirely new perfume categories, the democratization of luxury fragrance, the explosion of celebrity perfumes, the niche perfume movement, and the direct-to-consumer disruption of the beauty industry. A bottle sells every 30 seconds. That figure gets quoted frequently enough that it risks becoming meaningless. So let me put it in different terms. Chanel No. 5 sells approximately 2 million bottles per year, at an average retail price of somewhere between $100 and $200 per bottle. That's somewhere between $200 million and $400 million in revenue annually. From a single product, launched in 1921, The perfume business is also the part of Chanel that reaches the broadest demographic. A woman who cannot afford a Chanel suit and will never own a 2.55 handbag can still wear Chanel No. 5. That accessibility is not an accident. It is the democratic valve in an otherwise exclusive system. It creates brand connection with a consumer who might, 20 years later, be able to afford the bag, and who, in the meantime, is an ambassador for the brand every time she walks into a room. This two-tier architecture, extreme exclusivity in clothing and handbags, broader accessibility in fragrance, is one of Chanel's most sophisticated commercial structures. Chanel designed it intuitively in the 1920s. The Wertheimers have maintained and refined it deliberately ever since. Now let's come back to where Coco Chanel herself sits inside all of this, because she and the company are not the same thing. They never entirely were, even when she was alive. The Chanel company today is the Wertheimer family's company. It uses Coco Chanel's name, her aesthetic principles, her logo, her perfumes, and the cultural mythology built around her life. But it is not her legacy in any simple sense. It is what the Wertheimer family built using her as raw material. That distinction matters for how we think about what she actually achieved. What she actually achieved, stripped of the commercial superstructure that came after her death, was this. She changed the operating logic of women's fashion at a moment when that change was possible. She understood that the world was changing, that women were beginning to move through it differently, to work in it, to participate in public life in ways that the clothing of 1910 was physically incompatible with, and she designed for the world that was coming, rather than the world that was. That's the genuine genius, not the specific garments, not the logo, the ability to read a cultural inflection point and build for it. It's worth noting how rare that is. Most designers, most brilliant designers, talented designers, designers with far more formal training than Chanel ever had, design for the current moment or for a slightly idealized version of it. They read what customers want now and give them a refined version of it. Chanel did something different. She read what customers would want before they knew they wanted it, and made them an offer they hadn't known to request. The jersey fabric is the clearest example. In 1913, no woman was asking for jersey sportswear. There was no demand signal pointing at it. Chanel identified a latent need: comfort, freedom of movement, clothing that worked for an active life, and created the category. The customers didn't know they needed it until they wore it. That capacity to identify latent need and create the category rather than fill an existing one is what separates genuine market creators from very good market operators. Chanel was a market creator. In fashion, in perfume, in the whole idea of what a lifestyle brand could be, she built the category. Think about what a modern woman considers normal in her wardrobe. Trousers. Chanel was among the first women of social standing to wear them publicly in the 1920s, at a time when women in trousers were technically illegal in Paris, a law, incidentally, that was not formally repealed until 2013. Jersey knits. Standard now. Revolutionary in 1913. Costume jewelry worn alongside real jewelry, or instead of it, without embarrassment. Chanel made this philosophically acceptable, the idea that comfort and elegance are compatible rather than opposites. That ease of movement is a luxury rather than a compromise. That a woman's clothing should serve her rather than signal her husband's wealth. Every one of those ideas was at one point a Chanel position. Now they're just the air we breathe. That's how thoroughly she remade the baseline. The designers who followed her, Saint Laurent most explicitly, but also Rei Kawakubo at Comme des Garçons, Donna Karan, Giorgio Armani, all operated inside a frame that Chanel had built. Even the designers who positioned themselves against her aesthetic were positioning against a specific thing she had defined. You cannot be anti-Chanel without Chanel being the reference point.